The fog hung thick over Camp Pendleton as Private Morris crouched beside an old crate near the northern perimeter of the base. He heard a faint cry, weak, desperate, barely audible above the hum of the morning. "Sir, there's something alive in here," he called, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Sergeant Ethan Ward, a battle-worn Marine with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was no stranger to duty, nor to silence. His hazel eyes scanned the surroundings, weary from the years spent in combat, but today, something felt different. He knelt beside the crate, lifting the damp lid. A small, soaked German Shepherd puppy popped out, its amber eyes wide with defiance and confusion. The puppy's fur clung to its body, matted and shivering from the cold, yet there was something in its gaze that demanded attention. It wasn't just a puppy, it was something more. As Ethan carefully scooped the trembling creature into his arms, he heard the faintest growl, followed by a series of sharp yips. "Guess he's got opinions," Private Morris joked nervously. Ethan didn't smile. There was a connection here, one that went beyond simple survival. As the puppy wiggled in his grasp, Ethan murmured softly, "I've got you now." The Marine stood, his hand gently brushing the pup's head. There was an unspoken bond in the air, something inexplicable, but undeniable. The puppy's sounds, half whimper, half growl, seemed like it was trying to speak, almost as if it was speaking to Ethan, telling him something no one else could understand. "I'll call you Echo," Ethan said quietly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "Everything you say bounces back to me." Captain Nathan Cole, a sharp officer known for his steady authority, arrived on the scene, his eyes flicking between the puppy and Ethan. "Found yourself a new recruit, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice dry, but not unkind. Ethan nodded, cradling the puppy close. "Found him in a crate by the old range. Alone, cold and loud." "Keep it for a few days," Captain Cole ordered. "Have Dr. Sarah Kim look it over, then send it to the K-9 training unit in Nevada. He's expressive, but he's still just a pup." The puppy's bright amber eyes locked onto Ethan's, unwavering. It didn't seem like just a dog. It seemed like a presence, a force of nature. As the day wore on, Ethan couldn't help but notice how the puppy's antics brought a sense of lightness to the base. It wasn't just a dog, it was a companion, a piece of something bigger. When the pup let out another round of barks, this time more playful, Ethan chuckled, surprising even himself. "You're one loud recruit," he said, watching the puppy hop around. There was something oddly comforting in that bark, something that made the Marine's otherwise tense day seem a little bit easier. Dr. Sarah Kim, the base's veterinarian, arrived and gave the puppy a quick exam. "He's a fighter," she said with a smile, her hands gentle as she checked the pup's limbs and coat. "He's got a good heart." Ethan nodded, feeling an unspoken bond strengthen. The puppy may have been abandoned, but in Ethan's arms, it had found its place. As he carried Echo to the small supply shed that served as a temporary kennel, Ethan felt the strange stirrings of hope in his chest, the kind of hope he hadn't felt in years. Echo, the puppy that no one expected to survive, was teaching Ethan something he had almost forgotten: to fight for something you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you. The days passed, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility for the small German Shepherd. Every time he walked past the supply shed, Echo would bark excitedly, his tail wagging like it had a mind of its own. The little puppy had quickly become a source of comfort, not just for Ethan, but for the whole base. Soldiers who had seen their fair share of battle found themselves smiling as Echo's playful antics brought an unexpected lightness to their day. It was as though the puppy, despite his rough start, had a purpose here, a purpose that went beyond just being a pet. Ethan had never imagined a dog could have such an impact. As the days grew colder, Ethan started taking Echo out on walks. He wasn't supposed to, not yet, but it was hard to resist the bond that was forming. The puppy, still small but growing every day, would trot along beside him, a constant reminder of what it meant to have someone by your side. They walked along the base, passing the trucks and barracks, the sound of boots on gravel filling the air. It was early morning, and the fog was still thick, wrapping around the buildings like a blanket. Ethan breathed in the crisp air, letting it fill his lungs as Echo sniffed at the ground, his ears perked, eyes wide with curiosity. There was something special about the mornings here. They were quiet, still, and Ethan could almost pretend for a moment that everything was normal, that he was just another Marine going about his day. But that sense of normalcy never lasted long. The reminder of his injury, the lingering pain, and the weight of the past would always return. And yet, Echo made it bearable. One morning, as they walked near the edge of the base, Echo stopped in his tracks. Ethan turned to look, following the puppy's gaze. For a moment, everything was still. Then Echo's ears pricked up, and he let out a sharp bark, running towards something in the distance. Ethan followed, unsure of what had caught the puppy's attention. As they rounded the corner of a building, they came across an old, abandoned vehicle that had been left behind. The once shiny surface was now dull, covered in dirt and grime, and the wheels were half buried in the overgrown grass. Echo stood in front of it, barking fiercely, as if he had found something important. Ethan knelt beside him, curious. He looked around the vehicle, but saw nothing unusual. For a moment, the only sound was Echo's excited barking, his voice echoing in the stillness of the morning. Ethan's heart raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He reached out to calm Echo, but the puppy didn't stop. Instead, he pawed at the ground, whining, his body tense. Ethan stood up, scanning the area. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a figure. A Marine, standing just beyond the fence, watching them. The figure was still, almost ghost-like, and the sight of him sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He knew who it was. It was Max. He had been gone for so long, Ethan hadn't dared to hope. But now, standing just outside the base, watching them from the shadows, was the dog who had once been his constant companion. Echo's barking grew louder, more insistent. He wasn't afraid. He was welcoming Max back, as if he knew something Ethan didn't. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, heart pounding in his chest. Could it be possible? Could Max, his loyal canine partner, really be back? He called out, his voice hoarse, "Max." The figure in the distance didn't move. But Echo's reaction spoke louder than anything. The puppy was no longer barking. Instead, he stood perfectly still, eyes locked on the figure, waiting. Ethan's mind raced. Was this some kind of sign? A moment of clarity? His breath caught in his throat as he took another step forward, the fog lifting just enough for him to see the outline of the dog's silhouette. It was Max. His heart skipped a beat. He was here. After all these years, Max had come back. And somehow, Echo had known before anyone else. Ethan's legs shook, his body trembling with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. He could hardly breathe as he took another step toward Max, calling out once more, "Max, is it really you?" The fog parted just enough to reveal the unmistakable form of his old canine partner, standing silently, waiting. The reunion that neither of them had ever truly believed would happen was about to unfold, and Ethan could hardly believe it was real. As Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, the fog began to lift just enough for him to make out the figure before him. There, standing at the edge of the base, was Max, his loyal canine companion. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. Max's amber eyes locked onto Ethan's, and there was no mistaking the recognition. Ethan's hands shook as he took another step, his voice hoarse. "Max, is it really you?" Max didn't move, but his tail began to wag slowly, almost as if he was waiting for permission. The silence was heavy, charged with the unspoken bond that had always existed between them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to say. All the years apart, all the pain, all the loss, it all came rushing back in an instant. Max had been his partner, his protector, through some of the toughest moments of his life. They had fought side by side in battles, faced dangers that most couldn't even imagine, and yet here they were, reunited after so long. Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. He stepped closer, reaching out a trembling hand. Max's eyes never left him, and as if understanding the gesture, the dog took a tentative step forward. The distance between them closed in a heartbeat, and before Ethan knew it, Max was standing right in front of him. The Marine dropped to his knees, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Max leaned in, his head nuzzling against Ethan's chest. The touch was familiar, comforting, and it felt like coming home. For a moment, the weight of the years apart seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, together again, in a moment of pure connection. Ethan closed his eyes, his hand running through Max's fur, the warmth of the dog grounding him in a way nothing else could. He could hardly believe this was real. Max had found his way back to him, despite all the odds. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and in that moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. Max pulled back slightly, his eyes still fixed on Ethan, as if asking, "Are you okay?" Ethan chuckled softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm fine now, buddy." Max let out a small whine, nuzzling closer, sensing the mix of relief and overwhelming joy that Ethan couldn't put into words. They stayed like that for a while, lost in the simplicity of the moment. The rest of the base seemed distant, as if the world around them had faded away. It was just the two of them, like it used to be, before everything had changed. The years of separation melted away, and Ethan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey back to each other hadn't been easy, but here they were, standing side by side once more. As Max lay down beside him, Ethan leaned back against the base of a nearby building, looking out at the fog that was slowly lifting. It was a new beginning, a second chance. Ethan knew that Max had been through his own struggles, but the dog's loyalty had never wavered, and now, Ethan would do everything in his power to make sure they never had to be apart again. The bond between them was more than just that of a Marine and his K9. It was a promise that no matter what, they would always have each other. And for the first time in years, Ethan finally felt like he was home. As days passed, Ethan found himself growing more comfortable with the presence of Max by his side. The fog had cleared, and so had the haze that had clouded his mind for so long. Together, they walked through the base, a Marine and his dog, side by side once more. The bond they shared was something unspoken, something deeper than words. Ethan couldn't explain it, but he didn't need to. Max's loyalty was enough. It always had been. They spent their days walking through the base, sometimes stopping to watch the sunrise, sometimes just sitting in silence, enjoying the calm. The other Marines began to take notice of the reunion. They could see how Ethan's demeanor had changed. There was a lightness to him now, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. Max had brought him back to life in ways he couldn't have imagined. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the base, Ethan and Max sat on a bench outside the barracks. The air was cool, and the sound of boots marching in the distance was the only noise that filled the silence. Ethan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. It was a peaceful night, the kind he had longed for. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but always alert. Ethan reached down and gently scratched behind Max's ears, a gesture that was both comforting and familiar. It felt good to have him there, to know that they were both finally safe. "You know," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I had lost everything. But now, I have you again." Max looked up at him, his amber eyes full of understanding. It was as if he knew exactly what Ethan meant. In that moment, Ethan realized that Max wasn't just a dog. He was family, and that bond was unbreakable. Max had been through so much, just like Ethan. They had both seen the worst of the world, but they had survived together. They were survivors, and nothing could tear them apart. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself reflecting on the time he had spent without Max. It had been a lonely and difficult road, one that he wasn't sure he could have navigated without the memories of their time together. But now that Max was back, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. Together, they could face anything. The world was a little less dark with Max by his side. The bond they shared was not just about loyalty, it was about understanding. Max didn't need words to communicate. His presence alone was enough to make Ethan feel seen, heard, and understood. It was a comfort he couldn't put into words. As they sat there, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude. He wasn't alone anymore. Max had come back to him, and they would walk this journey together. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. With Max by his side, he knew they could face whatever came their way. The world might still be uncertain, but one thing was for sure, Max would always be there. And for that, Ethan was thankful. The days continued to pass, and Ethan found himself settling into a routine. He woke up every morning with Max by his side, the comforting presence of the dog grounding him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The pain from his past seemed to lessen, bit by bit, as he and Max shared quiet moments together. They still took their walks around the base, but now, the walks were more than just an escape. They were a reminder of the bond they shared. Each step was a step towards healing, towards finding peace again. The other Marines noticed the change in Ethan. He had always been the quiet, reserved type, but now, there was a lightness to him that hadn't been there before. They saw how he interacted with Max, how the dog's presence seemed to bring him back to life in ways that words could never describe. Ethan smiled more, laughed more, and even began to open up a little more. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And it was all because of Max. One afternoon, after a particularly long walk, Ethan and Max sat down on the steps outside the barracks, watching the sun dip low in the sky. The colors of the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, and for a moment, the world felt still. Ethan took a deep breath, savoring the calm. He felt Max nudge his hand, and when he looked down, the dog was sitting next to him, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes. Ethan reached down, his fingers grazing the soft fur of Max's head. He had never thought he would get a second chance like this. A second chance to heal, a second chance to live without the shadows of war hanging over him. "You know, Max," Ethan said softly, his voice low, "I never thought I'd be here again. After everything we've been through, I thought I'd lost it all. But somehow here we are." Max's ears perked up at the sound of Ethan's voice, his tail giving a small wag as if he understood. Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with a sense of gratitude. He had come home from the war, but it wasn't just the place that had changed. It was him. And it was because of Max. The dog had brought him back from the edge, pulled him from the darkness, and given him the strength to move forward. It was a bond that went beyond words, beyond the shared experiences they had in battle. It was a bond of trust, loyalty, and love. They had both endured their own battles, their own scars. But now, they were together again, and nothing else mattered. As the sun set, Ethan leaned back against the steps, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. Max lay beside him, resting his head on Ethan's leg, the two of them content in the silence. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he could breathe. The weight of the past had lifted, and the future no longer felt so uncertain. With Max by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next, together. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Ethan couldn't help but feel that everything was exactly as it was meant to be. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Max. As the days continued to blend together, Ethan found himself in a rhythm he never thought he would experience again. The constant ache of his past was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but Max's presence was like a light that cut through the darkness. Every morning, they would walk the same paths they had before, but now there was a sense of peace in the air, a tranquility that Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. They walked along the perimeter of the base, the cool morning air filling their lungs as they made their way through the quiet grounds. Max's ears would perk up every now and then, his sharp senses still on alert, but his tail wagged with a contentment that spoke of trust and safety. Ethan could feel that same sense of peace settle within himself as they walked. It was the kind of calm he had longed for, the kind that came with knowing that no matter what came next, Max would be by his side. One afternoon, as they sat together in the barracks courtyard, the sounds of other Marines talking and laughing in the distance, Ethan couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed. It was as if Max had pulled him from the edge, showing him that there was still so much to live for, so much to appreciate. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Ethan murmured, his hand resting on Max's back. Max turned his head to look at him, his amber eyes full of understanding, as if he knew exactly what Ethan meant. It was a bond that went beyond words. There was something in Max's presence that made Ethan feel whole again. Even in the quiet moments, when they were simply sitting together, the world seemed a little bit brighter. As the weeks passed, Ethan started to feel a shift within himself. The war, the battles, the loss, while they were still a part of him, they no longer defined him. With Max by his side, he was learning how to move forward, how to let go of the things that had haunted him for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of his past felt unbearable, but those days were fewer now. Max had a way of reminding him that there was still love, still joy to be found in this world. Ethan chuckled softly as Max playfully pawed at his boot, breaking him out of his thoughts. The dog's antics were a constant source of amusement, and they brought a lightness to Ethan's heart that he hadn't felt in years. He reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, a gesture that was as natural as breathing. "You. No, I think you've saved me more times than I can count," Ethan said, his voice low but filled with emotion. Max responded with a soft whine, as if in agreement. Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It was hard to put into words, but Max had become so much more than just a dog to him. He was a companion, a lifeline, a reminder that even after everything, there was still hope. The days stretched on, and Ethan began to see the world through a different lens. He had Max, and that was enough. They were together again, and in that bond, he found the strength to keep moving forward. No matter where life took them, Ethan knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. As the weeks went by, Ethan felt more and more at ease in his new life. With Max by his side, the heavy burden he had carried for so long seemed to lighten, even if just a little. He had come to realize that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the past while still looking forward to the future. Max had shown him that, without even trying. Every day felt like a small victory. Ethan had begun to reconnect with the world around him, with the people he had distanced himself from during his darkest days. The other Marines on base, once strangers, now greeted him with familiar smiles, and he found himself talking more, laughing even. Max had a way of bringing that out of him. The little dog had become a bridge between his past and his present, making him feel whole again in ways he hadn't thought possible. One morning, as they walked through the base, Ethan noticed a change in the air. It was different, quieter somehow. The sounds of the base, once constant and sometimes overwhelming, were now almost peaceful. The fog had rolled in thicker than usual, shrouding everything in a soft, muted glow. Max, as always, was by his side, his paws patting gently on the ground. But today, he was more alert, his ears perked up, his eyes scanning the fog ahead of them. Ethan slowed his pace, watching Max with a quiet sense of curiosity. Something was different, something he couldn't quite place, but it didn't feel like danger. It felt like a moment. A moment of clarity, of stillness. As they neared the end of their walk, Max stopped suddenly. His tail stiffened, and he stood tall, his gaze fixed on something ahead of them. Ethan followed his gaze, his heart skipping a beat as he saw a figure emerge from the mist. For a moment, his breath caught in his chest. The figure was tall, standing just at the edge of the base, surrounded by the soft, swirling fog. Ethan's mind raced. Was it real? Could it be? As the figure came closer, Ethan's breath steadied, and the fog lifted just enough for him to recognize the shape. It was a Marine, one he hadn't seen in years, someone from his past. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The figure was walking toward him, slowly, deliberately. Max's tail wagged once, then stopped, his body stiffening as he turned to look up at Ethan, as if asking for permission. Ethan gave him a nod, and together they took a step forward. The Marine, who had once been a close friend of Ethan's, stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with years of unspoken understanding, of shared memories. Finally, the Marine spoke, his voice deep and steady. "You're back," he said, his eyes scanning Ethan, taking in the change. "It's good to see you, man." Ethan smiled, the words catching in his throat. "It's good to be back," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. There was so much he wanted to say, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to. They both knew. Max, still standing between them, let out a soft bark, breaking the moment. The Marine chuckled softly, crouching down to pet the dog. "Looks like you've got a good partner now." Ethan nodded, his gaze shifting to Max. "Yeah, he's been my saving grace." As the fog began to lift and the sun broke through the clouds, Ethan realized that life wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to embrace it. Max had shown him how to do that, how to move forward while honoring the memories that had shaped him. And with the support of his old friend, the road ahead didn't seem so uncertain anymore. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to realize that his life was shifting in ways he had never expected. The small, seemingly insignificant moments now held more weight than they ever had before. He would wake up every morning, feeling the warmth of Max curled up next to him, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of peace. The world outside was still unpredictable, but with Max by his side, it felt like there was a safe place, a sanctuary. One morning, as they walked along the base, Ethan noticed the trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. It was the kind of day that felt perfect, like everything had aligned just right. Max trotted beside him, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his movements graceful, yet always on alert. Ethan smiled, thinking about how much the dog had brought to his life. In some ways, Max had been the anchor he didn't know he needed. They came to a stop near the old training grounds, a place that held so many memories for Ethan. He could still remember the long days spent running drills, the camaraderie with the other Marines, and of course, the constant presence of Max by his side. Ethan sat on a nearby bench, his gaze drifting across the familiar landscape. Max lay down beside him, resting his head on his paws, his eyes never leaving Ethan. They didn't need words. They never had. It was always enough to just be together, to share these moments of quiet. As the hours passed, Ethan's mind wandered back to the days when everything had seemed so much harder. The pain, the loss, the overwhelming grief. But now, everything felt different. It wasn't that the past didn't still affect him, but it no longer defined him. He had Max, and that meant everything. The dog had brought him back from the edge, showing him that there was still so much to live for, so much to appreciate. And now, sitting here, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope. "You've changed my life, Max," Ethan said softly, looking down at the dog. Max let out a soft whine, his tail thumping lightly against the ground. It was as if he understood, as if he knew exactly what Ethan meant. Ethan reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, the familiar feeling of the dogs for comforting him. The bond they shared was something that couldn't be put into words. It was something felt in the quiet moments, in the moments of stillness when they were simply together. And it was enough. Max had taught him that healing didn't happen all at once. It was a slow process, one that happened in the small moments, in the walks, in the quiet companionship. It was about learning to accept the past while moving forward. And Max was the one who had shown him how to do that. The sun had set completely now, and the sky was dark, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. Ethan stood, stretching his legs, and Max followed suit, getting up and shaking out his coat. "Come on, buddy," Ethan said with a smile, patting his leg. They walked together, side by side, back toward the barracks. As they moved through the base, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He was alive, he was whole, and he was no longer walking this journey alone. And for that, he would be forever thankful. As the weeks passed, Ethan and Max's bond continued to grow stronger. The once muted life Ethan had been living began to feel more vibrant, and the pain from his past started to fade in the light of their shared moments. Max had become a constant, a source of comfort that Ethan could always count on. The base, which had once felt like a place of routine and emptiness, now felt like home. Ethan had found a place where he belonged again, not just with the other Marines, but with Max by his side. Each morning, as the sun began to rise, they took their walks. The fog, which had become a daily companion, would roll in thick and heavy, but Ethan no longer minded it. It was just another part of the morning. Max, of course, never hesitated. His sharp eyes and alert ears scanned the world around them as they walked side by side. Sometimes they would stop at a quiet corner of the base, sitting together and taking in the world around them. Ethan could feel the warmth of the sun, the coolness of the air, and the steady presence of Max. It was in those moments, when they were still, that Ethan felt the most at peace. There were no words needed. It was just the two of them, finding solace in the silence. One day, as they sat on the edge of a small hill overlooking the base, Ethan noticed the change in the air. The breeze was still, and the world felt quieter than usual. The Marines that usually filled the base with their conversations and laughter seemed to have disappeared into their routines. Ethan looked down at Max, who was sitting at his side, his eyes focused on the horizon. It was as if the dog could sense what was happening, as if he knew that this moment, this stillness, was something special. Ethan felt a shift within himself, a quiet realization that things had come full circle. He had come back from a life he never thought he would escape, from a past filled with pain and loss. But now, with Max by his side, he felt whole again. He wasn't just a Marine. He wasn't just someone who had survived the unthinkable. He was someone who had found peace. "You've been my anchor, buddy," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Max turned his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's, and for a moment, Ethan could have sworn the dog understood exactly what he meant. Max let out a soft, contented sigh and laid his head on Ethan's leg, his body relaxed, as if he, too, felt the weight of the moment. They stayed like that for a while, lost in the stillness, watching as the sun rose higher in the sky. The day had just begun, but in that moment, Ethan felt like time had slowed down. It was as if the world was waiting for them, waiting for Ethan to embrace the future, to continue moving forward with the one thing that had never left his side. Max had been there through the darkest moments of Ethan's life, and now he would be there for whatever came next. It wasn't the past that defined Ethan anymore. It was the present. And in the present, there was Max. And that was all he needed. The months continued to drift by, and Ethan found himself embracing his life in a way he hadn't thought possible. The pain of his past still lingered in the quiet moments, but it no longer consumed him. Every day was a new opportunity to experience life again, to find joy in the small things, like Max's wagging tail, or the warmth of the sun on his face. Max had become his constant, his companion through it all. Together, they navigated this new chapter, and Ethan realized that no matter where the path led, he would never walk alone. One evening, after a long day, Ethan sat on the porch of his quarters, Max lying by his feet. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Ethan gazed up, his mind quiet, a rare peace settling over him. It was as if the world had slowed down for this moment, giving him the time he needed to just be. He had been through so much, but he was still here, still standing. And now, with Max by his side, he was beginning to understand that survival wasn't just about getting through the hard times. It was about finding a reason to live for the good ones, too. "You've changed everything, buddy," Ethan murmured to Max, who looked up at him with those trusting amber eyes. Max let out a soft grunt, as if in agreement, then nuzzled closer to Ethan's leg. It was a simple moment, but to Ethan, it meant everything. He reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, feeling the familiar warmth of the dog's fur under his fingertips. Max had been there through the hardest times, and now he was here, by his side, in this moment of peace. Ethan smiled softly. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and he was grateful for that. He could still remember the dark days, the times when he didn't know how he would move forward. But Max had been there, every step of the way, reminding him that there was still love, still hope, still the possibility of a future. He had never believed in miracles, but now, sitting here with Max at his side, Ethan realized that maybe he had been wrong. The small miracles, the ones that happened quietly in the background, were the ones that mattered most. It wasn't the grand moments that defined his life, but the simple, everyday ones, the walks with Max, the shared silences, the companionship that never faltered. They had both been through the fire and come out the other side. And in this moment, Ethan knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't afraid. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that no matter what, he would always have Max. And that was all he needed. As the months rolled on, Ethan felt an unspoken peace settle over him. The days were no longer filled with the constant ache of the past. He had begun to live, really live, for the first time in years. Max had shown him what it meant to move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by embracing the present. Each morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Ethan found himself more grateful than ever for the simple things in life. The morning walks with Max, the stillness of the world before the noise of the day began, the sound of Max's paws padding along the ground beside him. These were the moments that filled his heart. There was no rush, no pressure, just the two of them, walking side by side through the quiet of the base. The other Marines, too, had noticed the change in Ethan. The man who had once been distant and withdrawn was now more open, more present. He smiled more, laughed more, and even shared stories of his time with Max. They had become an inseparable pair, a symbol of loyalty, healing, and the unbreakable bond that had grown between them. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the barracks, watching the stars slowly fill the sky, Ethan thought back on all that had led him to this moment. He had come so far, from the darkness of war to the quiet peace he now shared with Max. The road had been long, but in the end, it had led him here, to a life that felt worth living. "You know, buddy," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought I'd be able to say this, but I'm starting to feel like I'm finally home." Max, who was lying at his feet, lifted his head and looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with understanding. The dog let out a soft whine, as if to acknowledge the bond they shared. Ethan reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, the familiar gesture filling him with a sense of comfort. In that moment, as he sat there with Max by his side, Ethan knew that he was exactly where he needed to be. There would still be challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. With Max by his side, he knew they could take on whatever came their way. They had already overcome so much together, and there was nothing that could break the bond they had forged. The quiet evening stretched on, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. Ethan felt a sense of calm wash over him, the kind of peace that only comes when you know you're not alone. And in that moment, with Max at his side, he realized that he had found a new purpose. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the present, about living each day to the fullest, knowing that with Max by his side, he could face anything the world threw his way. The days passed with an ease that Ethan hadn't known in years. It wasn't that everything was perfect. Life rarely was. But with Max by his side, he had found something far more valuable: peace. The bond they shared had become his anchor, and each day, he felt more connected to the world around him. The base had become home in a way it never had before, and the routine of daily life felt comforting, even in its simplicity. Every morning, he would wake up to the sound of Max's soft breathing beside him, the dog's steady presence a constant reminder that he was no longer alone. As the sun rose each day, casting a warm glow over the base, Ethan would take Max out for their usual walk, the familiar path lined with trees swaying gently in the wind. The world seemed to wake up with them, the quiet moments shared between man and dog stretching on like a peaceful rhythm. They didn't need to speak. The simple act of being together was enough. It was during one of these walks, as the fog rolled in thick and heavy, that Ethan felt a shift. He had become so accustomed to the stillness that now surrounded him that the world seemed to slow down as they walked together. Max, as always, was alert, but the dog's tail wagged lazily, a sign of his contentment. Ethan stopped at the end of their walk and looked out over the horizon. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting long beams of light over the land. There was a sense of quiet in the air, an unspoken understanding that this moment was special. Max sat beside him, his warm body a reminder that no matter how uncertain the future might be, they would always have each other. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he had been through lift slightly. He had been through the darkest times, but now, with Max at his side, he could see the light. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It wasn't about some grand gesture or miracle. It was the quiet, steady progress of healing, the slow rebuilding of his life one small step at a time. And Max had been there for all of it. Ethan reached down and ran his hand through Max's fur, a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he whispered softly to the dog. Max turned his head, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's, and gave a small, contented sigh. The moment was simple, but it meant everything to Ethan. It was in these moments, the ones that felt so small yet so significant, that he truly understood what it meant to heal. As the light of the day grew brighter and the world around him seemed to wake up, Ethan felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't that the past was gone. It was always going to be a part of him. But now, he had found a way to live with it, to move forward, and he knew that Max would be there with him, every step of the way. As the months turned into years, Ethan's life became more and more intertwined with Max's. The past, once so overwhelming, had faded into a distant memory, and what remained was a life that was no longer defined by what had happened, but by what was to come. Together, they had built something new, something strong. Ethan no longer saw the world through the lens of loss and pain. Instead, he saw the possibilities, the future. The days no longer felt like a constant struggle. He had found peace, not in the absence of pain, but in the presence of Max, in the quiet moments they shared. Each walk, each morning spent together, had become a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond that had been forged through the fire of hardship. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and the stars began to appear in the sky, Ethan sat on the porch of his quarters, Max lying beside him. The weight of the world felt lighter in these moments, the simple act of being together enough to calm any lingering doubts. Max was no longer just a dog. He was family, and in many ways, he was the key to Ethan's healing. He had brought Ethan back from the brink, and together, they had learned to live again. Ethan reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur, the familiar gesture filling him with a deep sense of gratitude. "You've done more for me than I can ever put into words," Ethan said softly. Max, as always, responded with a soft whine, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was an understanding between them that went beyond words. Max had been with him through it all, and Ethan had no doubt that they would continue to face whatever came next, together. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, and Ethan turned to see one of the other Marines, a familiar face he hadn't seen much of lately. The Marine smiled and waved, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of connection to the people around him. He wasn't isolated anymore. He wasn't alone. "Hey, Ethan. Good to see you out here," the Marine said, his voice warm. Ethan returned the smile, feeling the weight of the past few years lift even more. "Yeah, it feels good," he replied. "It's been a while." The Marine nodded, glancing down at Max. "Looks like you two are doing well," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, we're good," Ethan said, his voice steady. And it was true. They were good. The bond between him and Max was unshakable. They had been through so much together, and now, they were building a future that was theirs. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The Marine stayed for a while, talking to Ethan about life on base, the changes, and the quiet moments that made it all worth it. And as the night deepened and the stars shone brighter, Ethan realized that the future was no longer a place he feared. With Max by his side, he was ready for whatever it held. The journey they had been on together had changed him, but it had also shown him that there was still so much to live for. And no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure. He would always have Max. And that was more than enough.